the truth is, if not one single European country paid a pound, euro, or krona for their defense, it still is in the interest of the United States that Europe is secure and stable and prosperous. So that's why I feel confident that we're never going to turn our back on Europe. I think it's Vladimir Putin who has inspired people to get interested in spending again, not Donald Trump. I have to say, I thought it was brilliant when President Macron made this comment about leaving the option on the table. Even if he never intends to send a single French soldier to Ukraine, why in the world would we tell the Russians what we're not going to do? I mean, this is basic strategic art, trying to get the initiative, make your enemy worry about what you might do. Instead, the norm is that we're always worried about what the Russians might do.
Yes.
So I love that he did it, and now several other countries like Latvia are saying, well, it's a good idea to keep that option open.
Yeah, so listen to this. This is the British Defence Secretary, former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace.
I think we should use those phrases. We can't rule them out. I mean, ultimately, part of deterrence is ambiguity. You know, keeping our adversary guessing about how far we would go and what we do. That's what Putin does masterfully. He keeps everyone guessing. It's very important that we never shut off avenues. Doesn't mean to say that we necessarily will, but it's also important that we keep people guessing.
I mean, he echoes the point you're making, General, doesn't he? And Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have made a science out of this playing the guessing game to their advantage.
Well, the part and parcel of how Russia does what they do is through threats and constantly talking about nuclear weapons, or we have no choice but to use a nuclear weapon, or we are prepared to use a nuclear weapon, when the chance of them using a nuclear weapon is about zero. We have to take it serious, of course, because they have thousands of warheads, and they clearly don't care about how many innocent people, including their own, that they might kill. But they know that there are no positive outcomes for them if they use a nuke. But they see how we react, and we deter ourselves just at the mere thought that they might move a nuclear weapon into Belarus, for example. So this is part, competing in the information domain, I guess is how I would say it, is just as much a part of warfare as is providing ammunition.
Well, now, General, the idea is certainly taking root on this side of the Atlantic in Europe, that Europe, and I'm sorry to have to put this to you, but the view has grown that Europe can't count on America under a Donald Trump presidency in particular, if that's what happens, to stand by NATO allies, to honour Article 5 of the NATO Treaty of Mutual Defence. Do you consider that is now the unavoidable truth?
It's embarrassing for me that we even have to have this conversation, but the former president did cast doubt on American commitment and to Article 5. You remember when he said that he wasn't sure that he would support if Montenegro was attacked, and then recently his ridiculous and irresponsible statements about telling President Putin that he could do whatever he wanted with a NATO country that didn't pay to their 2%. I mean, just strategically illiterate as well as dangerous. So I can understand why our European allies and Canadian allies would begin to wonder about the United States. Fortunately, most of the Congress supports our commitments to Europe and supports the alliance. And I'm going to tell you this, John, I think, 8 months is a long time till this election, and I feel quite confident that President Biden is going to be reelected, not because I want it, but because I believe it.
Okay, well, of course, we will see how that plays out, but it's certainly right that the president, whoever the president happens to be, would need congressional approval to withdraw from NATO. That's right, isn't it? And you don't think that's conceivable?
So it was impressive to me that a few months ago, the Congress passed a bill that President Biden signed, which said that 2/3 of the Congress had to support it if a president wanted to pull the United States out of NATO. That means all the Republicans supported this as well, because they knew that a guy like Trump might actually seriously consider doing it. So even Donald Trump could not unilaterally say, okay, we're out. Now, of course, he can affect funding and decisions, but at least he is the president. No president could unilaterally do this. But that's, again, in my professional life, I never imagined that any American president would ever cast doubt on American commitment. Um, our prosperity depends on European prosperity. The access that our European allies give us for what we do in the Middle East and Africa, it's essential for us. This is not just about whether or not somebody pays 2%.
Well, really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Can we just talk a little bit about defence spending in NATO? I'll just invite you to have a listen again to this. This is Ben Wallace.
I'm worried that if we don't listen to the wake-up call that potentially is a Donald Trump win, then we will be left more vulnerable in Europe. You know, the one thing that Donald Trump and actually President Obama agreed on was that Europe needed to carry its weight in defense of itself. 83% of NATO funding is by countries outside the EU. So I think it's important that we listen to those alarms, or indeed those warning shots. And I think we need to set our defense spending not in the terms of when economic conditions allow, which is the current prime minister and government's policy, but very obviously when the threat demands it.
Interesting points, those, aren't they, General, from Ben Wallace, describing Donald Trump's words on NATO. They're not words that you would wish to hear, but they may well have had the effect of rather galvanizing NATO in seeing a need to be stronger in its own defense in Europe.
Well, look, every president since Truman has complained that our European allies were not doing enough for their defense. But the truth is, if not one single European country paid a pound, euro, or krona for their defense, it still is in the interest of the United States that Europe is secure and stable and prosperous. So that's why I feel confident that we're never going to turn our back on Europe. I think it's Vladimir Putin who has inspired people to get interested in spending again, not Donald Trump. Even with the U.S. being totally committed to European security, we don't have enough by ourselves to deter Russia, deter China, deal with Iran, and all the other challenges that are out there. So yes, of course, European countries are waking up. I think our Eastern European allies have never been confused about this. It was more the Western continental Europe that was in a slumber the last several decades. This is changing, and I think we're going to see improvements in the logistics. We have to see improvements in air and missile defense. The Russians clearly, if they've made the terrible decision to attack a NATO country, they've already made the decision to use missiles against civilian infrastructure, as they have in Ukraine. So this is an area that all of us have got to do a lot more.
All right. U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Really great to get your thoughts, General. Thank you.
Thanks for the privilege.